It's our last Viewsroom of the year, and what a year it has been. Inflation, China's stimulus, the obesity drug craze were all leading the headlines, as was succession at JP Morgan, problems at Boeing, and an upcoming IPO for fast fashion giant Shein. For the last Viewsroom episode of the year, we're taking a look at these stories and asking why they were so fascinating and how they've moved on. Welcome back to the Viewsroom, the weekly podcast that invites you, the listener, into a lively debate with Breakingviews columnists. And I'm your host, Amy Donlan.
And I'm Peter Thar-Larsen. So Amy, it's been quite a year. We're sort of looking back at some of the episodes that we had over the year that were the most popular with our listeners. It's quite a motley bunch of subjects.
It is, absolutely. So there's things you could kind of bundle together. So you could maybe bundle the macroeconomic stuff, which was obviously the big story that very much led the US election, which was inflation in the US, as well as over in China, how China was going to go about kind of reviving its lackluster economy when that stimulus was likely to happen. But then, Peter, obviously there was also some really interesting kind of personality stories. I think, JP Morgan, when Jamie Dimon was going to eventually leave and who would replace him was also very interesting.
Well, and yeah, I guess it's a reflection of the wide and eclectic interests of our extremely well-informed listeners and of course of our columnists. But also, a lot of these subjects are still live, right? I mean, we can talk about some of these things: inflation, China. Jamie Dimon is still running JP Morgan as we speak. So, lots to talk about. So let's bring in for this conversation two senior editors, Jeff Goldfarb, global corporate finance editor at Breakingviews, and George Hay, who runs EMEA at Breakingviews. Welcome, Jeff and George.
Hi there.
Thanks.
So in some ways, I think let's sort of try and take some of these stories sort of kind of one by one. I mean, so let's start with inflation. I mean, that was kind of the big topic, definitely at the beginning of the year, arguably also the big topic in the many, many elections that took place in 2024. And so, Jeff, how do you think that played out? And can we now, at the end of 2024, safely proclaim inflation to be dead?
Well, I think the big achievement was certainly getting inflation to a 3-year low, at least in the United States. Unfortunately, it was not a saving factor for Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. Despite having made that achievement, the record high inflation was too much to overcome, as it was in so many countries and elections. So, it was encouraging to see the rate come down. I think there's still some question about whether or not, interest rates will come down much further. Some folks are still holding out for more, I think. But there seems to be something of a, maybe a settling consensus that, we're not going back to where we were. Maybe it's a little bit lower from where we are now. I spoke with Jeff Pearlman, who runs Warburg Pincus at the Reuters Next conference recently, and asked him where he thought 10-year Treasury rates would be in 3 years. And he said he wouldn't surprise him if there were a 5 handle or a 4 handle on them. So I think, maybe there's a sense, certainly from the buy side, that, that we could settle into a range here. Of course, the wild card is Trump's policies, right? There's a fear that tariffs, tax cuts, deportations will all have massive inflationary effects. So, I think that kind of remains to be seen.
Yeah, and everybody remembers the 1970s, when we had a sort of inflationary spike, and at various stages it seemed like it had gone away, and then something would flare up again. I guess, George, least we haven't had a Middle East oil shock in quite the same way this time around that we've had in the 1970s.
Well, no, and I mean, despite all sorts of kind of geopolitical flashpoints happening in the Middle East, the oil price has kind of bumped along kind of in the 70s, came down from in the 80s a bit earlier, but like it's, if anything, next year people are assuming that the pressure is kind of down rather than up, because most of the forecasters are saying that there'll be a big surplus, so a big glut of oil. So, you know, that's the obvious kind of way in which the game could change on inflation, but like doesn't look like it's going to right now.
Yeah. And Peter, I was kind of curious, we talked obviously about the US, the world's largest economy, and the second largest economy, obviously China, was very interesting to our readers as well, as Xi Jinping tried in many ways to revive the economy. I'm just sort of curious, Peter, what do you think where do you think we go in 2025? What do you think investors are looking at when they look at China for the year ahead, and how that's likely to change?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny you talk about inflation. I mean, China has the opposite problem, right? If anything, China's probably dealing with at least the looming threat of kind of deflation, and deflation is really bad when you've got an economy that's got loads of debt, as the Chinese economy does. So, and for a long time, people were slightly wondering why the authorities were not more concerned about this, and then in the summer they started to try and do something about it. Took some fairly drastic measures at the sort of central bank level, trying to sort of stimulate the housing market. And there's this sort of promise of fiscal stimulus, but it hasn't really materialized. And so I would say, you know, there's been a reaction in the markets. You know, the Chinese equity market particularly rallied quite a lot. But it's then come down again a bit as people sort of take a slightly more tentative approach to the stimulus. So I think, you know, in 2025, I think people are still waiting to see whether what the Chinese authorities are going to do to keep growth going. I suspect that what they do depends to quite a large extent on what happens in the US and what Trump does with respect to tariffs towards China. I mean, if he actually follows through on his threat of 60% tariffs on China, then China may have no choice but to to come back with some sort of stimulus. And so there is a sense probably the Chinese are slightly keeping their powder dry to see what happens in the US and to see how much of a response is required. So that will be a key issue to watch. But the Chinese economy is not in great shape, and that means that China's also potentially a bit more vulnerable to the costs of a trade war than it was 8 years ago.
Absolutely. And Jeff, the other story I think that I think is such a people person, and it comes around every few years, which is Jamie Dimon running the biggest bank in the US. When will he step down? Who will replace him? There's always like a lot of names that are thrown around, and then sometimes those people end up leaving the bank. Then we've also got Donald Trump now, who's the president-elect, who's going to be taking over next year. And I guess, again, people might be wondering whether Jamie Dimon could get a role in his government. So what's your take on that story, whether that is evolving from what we were writing about during the year?
Yeah, well, Jamie Dimon now wrapping up his, I think, 19th year at JP Morgan. I'm old enough to remember this palace intrigue happening like more than a decade ago, as I'm sure the rest of you are as well. Yeah, and as you say, there are people that were named as potential successors, like Jess Staley and Bill Winters and Charlie Scharf, and whether they ever really were, we don't know, but they're long gone from JP Morgan and have gone on to run other institutions. So, it's an interesting question. I think the reason all of these palace intrigue is obviously of great interest to our listeners and our readers, because it's their industry for a lot of them. The question with Dimon is actually probably more relevant because he has been sort of a self-anointed industry spokesman. And so you wonder, like, if and when obviously at some point he will leave, like who will fill that spot, if anyone, whether it's, his successor at JP Morgan, or whether it's another one of the CEOs to really take the battle to Washington, as Jamie has done. The other question really is for JP Morgan shareholders, employees, clients, is that, since Jamie took over in the end of 2005, the returns at JP Morgan, have been somewhere like close to 900% on a total return basis, which is 20 times what Bank of America did, triple Wells Fargo, and Citigroup. Poor Citigroup over that span has lost money, destroyed value. So, I mean, the question then becomes, like, how much of the premium that's built into JP Morgan's valuation and its performance is attributable to Jamie Dimon? And that, I think, is sort of an open-ended question, or whether he has built, an institution that can continue to deliver these kinds of results without him being there personally. So, it's like I said, it's one of the, we always have this palace intrigue. We just wrapped it up at Morgan Stanley. We always hear about it at Goldman. It's always, a fun question to talk about. There's actually, I think, some real substantive relevance to the question at JP Morgan for a whole host of reasons.
Yeah, yeah. And sorry, just to keep you on the spot, Jeff, sort of from one historical success story to one historical nosedive, really, I think is the only way to describe it, which is Boeing, a story we talked about earlier this year, when they were having big sort of safety problems and questions about the management and strikes amongst the workers. One question that comes up a lot is Boeing too big to fail for the US? Does there come a point where the US government sort of has to somehow step in or support Boeing? I mean, if you would think, there's Boeing and there's Airbus, they sort of have a duopoly. It seems pretty unlikely that you kind of necessarily lose one of the members of the duopoly. But at times in the past year, it's felt pretty existential, hasn't it?
Yeah, it's been an interesting question, particularly because I guess the closest thing that the U.S. has to national champions, is probably a half a dozen companies. Boeing is certainly one, but we've also had this contrast with Intel, which is another one that's like struggling. And I guess if I had to put it like right now, as we head to the end of the year, Boeing may be kind of slightly on the uplift, while Intel is, slightly on the downturn. Boeing has a long way to go, but they have replaced the CEO. They did settle the strike with workers. They have started to build planes again and roll them off the production line. So there's a little bit of momentum there, and I think the choice of CEO Kelly Ortberg is creating a little bit of a more positive feeling. He comes with a bit of an engineering background, rather than a financial one. And that's, I think, really what Boeing is looking at. The problems there are, they're threefold, really. They're financial, they're cultural, and they're technological. The financial question is sort of, the big one. But if they can, they have this massive backlog, right? They've got orders for over 5,000 planes worth some $500 billion. So if they can start like building them and getting them out to customers, the money will start coming in again. The cultural one is a problem in the sense that they're making more repairs than they are building new planes. They've got to turn that around. And then I guess, the technical one, the technological one, is because they've been devoting so much money to capital returns to shareholders. The new development, the question of proceeding with developing a new plane has really kind of just constantly been pushed to the back burner. It's a big $30 to $50 billion undertaking that will take a lot of time if they choose to proceed with it. But I think that's kind of like the existential question for Boeing now, is like, what's next? And they've got so much to clean up in the immediate future that you wonder, like, how much time will there be to start thinking about the medium and long term.
Absolutely. And George, just to take you in here, because many of these stories have a climate link to them. Certainly the Boeing story does. And, so many companies we cover. And going back to, I remember when you were in Glasgow at that COP, and there was obviously such fanfare about climate and how investors were very passionately talking about companies having to clean up their act and, basically focus much more on how they were going to prepare for net zero. And I think that there was a real pendulum shift even further this year of what investors were talking about and thinking about. And I just was curious, what are your thoughts on this year, and how do you think things are going to be for next year when it comes to climate and that priority for investors?
Yeah, I mean, as you come to the end of the year, there's a fairly obvious glass half empty or nothing in the glass level of pessimism about the green issues and climate change. Because, I mean, it's really obvious. Donald Trump's got in. He's not a fan of particular types of renewables like offshore wind. He is not a fan of the Inflation Reduction Act, the Joe Biden's big chunk of subsidies that he brought in for green power. And he's a big fan of allowing oil companies to drill, baby drill, blah, blah, blah. All that sounds really bad, and it is bad. And around the same time, it was a pretty rubbish month for climate change, the fight against it. There was a COP29 in Baku in Azerbaijan. Basically, the name of the game there was to try and get up to the $1 trillion a year that needs to go from the developed world to the developing world to help them decarbonize. It didn't get anywhere near that. Got to like 300 billion, but that's not all sorts of kind of problems with that figure as well. So if you want to kind of just lock in absolutely awful 2025 for climate, you can do that. The facts would support that. All I'd say is that I don't think the fight against climate change will go like directly in the other direction. I don't think it will be kind of completely awful in 2025 for a number of reasons. One is that Trump, whatever he says about energy, his fairly consistent line is he wants cheap energy. And if you want cheap energy, one way to do that is there's lots of wind and onshore wind rather than offshore wind in the US. There's also a lot of solar. That is, if you look at it, cheap relative to other forms of electricity. And there needs to be a lot more electricity to kind of build out AI and the other things that Donald Trump wants to do. And what he said is he will kind of make permitting for energy projects a lot easier. Now, everyone rightly thinks that exclusively means oil, but I think you could see that happening, given a lot of the IRA subsidies go to Republican states. I think you could see some progress there. Also, you've got to remember that the US is not the only game in town when it comes to climate change and the fight against it. Huge amounts of renewables being built in China and other parts of the world as well. So I don't think that adds up to a kind of net positive. I think you have to be really, going some to get to a kind of positive outlook for climate change in 2025. But it's not uniformly negative by any stretch of the imagination.
All right, George, you filled up the glass a little bit. Thank you for that. Something for us to take into
a tenth full now.
Exactly. Something to take into the end of the year. Amy, come back to you. Couple of stories that you've been paying a lot of attention to that we've talked about over the year. The first one is the never-ending fascination with obesity drugs. We had Eli Lilly and Novo Nordisk, these two big drug makers that have been struggling to meet the insatiable demand for weight loss drugs. It feels like you can't pick up or click on a tabloid website without some sort of discussion of whether someone's taking Ozempic or taking something for the effects of Ozempic, or the effects of Ozempic is having, or Mounjaro or these other drugs are having on Wegovy, are having on consumption patterns and behaviors and all those kind of things. But from our perspective, I mean, there is this question about competition, right? Sort of, are others coming into this market, and is there going to be? I mean, these drugs are very expensive at the moment still. Should we expect a point where there will be more weight loss drugs on the market, and they will become cheaper?
I mean, I think certainly from the perspective of the other pharmaceutical companies, so not Eli Lilly and not Novo Nordisk, but the likes of AstraZeneca, Roche in Switzerland, Pfizer, they're all trying to make versions of these drugs, which will take some time. But it's interesting because obesity now is considered a disease, but it was not considered a disease for basically, I would say in the past, like before 5 years ago, it wasn't considered a disease. So companies weren't really focused on it. So they're kind of starting in some ways from a standing start. They've just realized as soon as, Ozempic started taking off, Eli Lilly's drug came out, that, the estimates that Jefferies has is that by 2030, the market could be worth $100 billion, which is a huge prize. And if there's only two companies going after it, then it makes sense that they're all doing this. But the problem for a competition is that these drugs, the ones that are already out there, the ones you mentioned, there's Mounjaro for Eli Lilly and there's Ozempic and Wegovy for Novo Nordisk, they do have side effects. And that's something that the other companies are trying to work on. They're trying to come out with drugs that don't have these side effects. So they would be more beneficial, more attractive. But yes, the more you flood this market with drugs, hopefully the supply starts to catch up with demand, and then you could start to see prices coming down. But we're certainly not seeing that happening at the moment. And if anything, a prediction of ours just went out today. We're recording on Tuesday, and it was basically to say that Eli Lilly and Novo Nordisk are going to be so swimming in cash next year that they can do really large deals if they want to, based purely on the amount of cash that they have. So it is definitely an interesting time for this market, and not least what you said. I mean, when I cover consumer goods groups as well, and I won't mention the names of the companies that say it to me, but every time I meet them, they say that people are calling them constantly, asking them how it's going to affect their business, how it's going to affect demand for their products. There's all sorts of things, like even, people who are taking these drugs apparently don't like drinking Diet Coke as much. And they have all sorts of other, as you mentioned, these sort of fringe effects that people aren't really, they're just coming to terms with now.
Yeah, still a lot of mileage in that story and in the impact on those drugs. I mean, you mentioned the possibility of deals. We haven't seen that many big deals this year. The other thing that we haven't had much of is IPOs, stock market listings. Although we do seem to have spent most of the year talking about the possibility of an IPO of Shein, the sort of the not Chinese but make stuff in China fast fashion company. You wrote about this several times, Amy, over the past year. We talked about it on the Viewsroom. I mean, is this IPO actually going to happen in 2025? Do you think?
I mean, this is the question. As you said, I mean, you can't go probably a week where there isn't a story about. I mean, first of all, just to give the bit of the backstory. This IPO was supposed to go to New York. It seemed like it was headed for New York, and then there was such a backlash within America about the possibility of this company, which there's question marks over its supply chain. There's question marks over, the people that are employed and are making these clothes, whether they're being paid properly, whether there's child labor being involved, all of those types of things. So then they pivoted and they decided we'll go to London instead. And it looked like all sorts of, it looked like basically London really wanted it, obviously, because
London is desperate for IPOs.
Yes,
right?
yes.
I mean,
desperate for IPOs. And it's like,
anything.
We all remember Saudi Aramco. It has a history of when they want a big listing like this, they will make changes. They will, try and make adjustments to make it more palatable for the company. So that's what we're really waiting for. Is there was, a story out today even talking about whether they would, only list like less than 10% of their shares, which would require a rule change. from the Financial Conduct Authority of the UK. So, I mean, it is a fascinating company, and I think it's fascinating even just from our listeners' perspective, because not least is it an IPO and there's banks involved and all the fees that go along with that. But I think a lot of people who have teenage daughters and sons will see these packages coming through their doorsteps every day, probably, in some cases. And it has, to George's point, it has an awful lot of climate implications as well. There's a lot of questions about this company and whether it, it should be doing the things that it's doing. And I think that even kind of European politicians bring up that quite a lot.
Yeah, well, and I can say definitely from the Breakingviews perspective, I think we spent a lot of time talking about the possibility of this IPO. If we actually had an IPO and the financial disclosures that go with it, and the ability to understand Shein's business model and the strengths and weaknesses of it, I think that would be a relief for all of us, because it would give us something a bit more substantial to get our teeth into. So that's kind of all we've got time for in this, the final Viewsroom of 2024. Amy mentioned earlier our predictions, which the Breakingviews team every year puts together a set of predictions for the year ahead, which is, we're not trying to be 100% accurate in terms of our forecast, but we're trying to be a bit provocative and give people a way to think about things that might happen. So those are being published at the moment. You can find them on breakingviews.com and on Reuters.com. But apart from that, really all there is for me to say is thank you, George, and thank you, Jeff. And I guess we'll see everybody early in the new year.
Thanks, Peter.
Thanks.